This is the fifth video in our series about the first Christmas. It discusses the Gospel of Matthew's report about King Herod murdering the children in Bethlehem, which many Christians call the slaughter of the innocents. Of all the great works that have ever been written, there is not a single one that contains more dramatic contrasts than chapter 2 of the Gospel of Matthew. It begins with a new light in the heavens, which guides wise men on a journey across vast distances to worship God, who has come to earth in the body of a small child. That child will grow to be a man who will atone for the sins of the world. But just a few verses later, a paranoid madman commits an atrocity of incomprehensible evil, the genocidal murders of all of the male babies and young boys in an entire region. This is a story of intrigue, deception, violence, deliverance, and hypocrisy. To many Christians, this is not just a story about the contrast between infinite good and pure evil. To many Christians, this is literal history. But to everyone, whether you are a Christian or not, this is a story of surprising complexity, where deceptions turn up in unexpected places, and the hero turns out to be almost as evil as the villain. So let's dig deeply into the biblical report of the slaughter of the innocents. Let's read the story together. I have omitted some parts of it for brevity. I encourage you to read the entire story in your own Bible. This is from the Revised Standard Bible. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem. Then Herod summoned the wise men and secretly ascertained from them what time the star appeared. And then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. When they heard the king, they went their way. The star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came to rest over the place where the child was. Going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, and frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there till I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, was in a furious rage, and he sent and killed all of the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time which he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they were no more. Obviously, the bad guy in this story is Herod, who used intrigue, deception, hypocrisy to help him commit acts of unspeakable violence. God, on the other hand, comes out of this looking really good. After all, he saved the lives of Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus and the wise men. Another winner in this story is the author of the Gospel of Matthew, whose Gospel has become one of the most famous books ever written. He is immortalized in numerous statues, and millions of Christians even believe that his book is perfect, inspired by God, incapable of having even the slightest error. But is it really so simple? Let's take a closer look at this story, starting with Matthew, whom Christians believe wrote the gospel bearing his name. We're going to examine two questions about the second chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. First, could this story have happened the way that Matthew says it did? And second, did Old Testament prophecy really predict the slaughter of the innocents? Could this story have happened the way the Gospel of Matthew says it did? Let's start from the beginning. Wise men come to Jerusalem from the east. They tell King Herod that they've seen a star, which meant that the new king of the Jews had been born. And the wise men ask where they can find this new king. By the way, this star had to be a very, very big star, visible to everyone. We explained why in video number 2 of this series. The result is that Herod and all Jerusalem were troubled. Herod was a paranoid sociopath. News of arrival, a new king born in his territory, would be very upsetting to him. And whenever he got upset, everyone got upset. So far, Matthew's story is consistent with what historians tell us about Herod. This verse contains an important point. Notice that this verse says that all Jerusalem knew about the Christmas star, and about the wise men, and about the newborn king of the Jews. For this to work, they had to see the star. If nobody could see the star, nobody would have believed the wise men, and nobody would have been troubled by what they said. So everybody had to have seen the star. Let's keep this in mind, because the fact that all Jerusalem saw the star and knew about the wise men and the new king of the Jews will become very important very soon. Now, back to Herod. Herod then asked the priests and scribes where the Christ, the Messiah, would be born. They replied, "In Bethlehem." Then the wise men left Herod's palace, and the star came to rest over the place where the child Jesus was. The wise men gave gifts to Jesus, and Joseph, and Mary. Then the wise men slipped away without Herod realizing they were gone, until they were too far away for him to catch them. And Jesus, Joseph, and Mary also slipped away without anyone noticing. Could all of this have happened the way that the Gospel of Matthew says it did? Herod was obsessed with the belief that he had to protect his kingdom at all costs. This caused him to kill many of his own close relatives, including 2 brothers-in-law, his mother-in-law, 1 wife, and 3 of his sons. But apparently it did not occur to Herod to have anyone accompany or secretly follow the wise men to Bethlehem. Jerusalem and Bethlehem were very close to each other. Less than 5 miles separated them. Herod could see Bethlehem from the upper stories of his palace in Jerusalem. Herod could easily see the star as it came to rest over where Jesus was after meeting with the wise men and sending them on their way, and Herod could see Bethlehem. He did not need for the wise men to tell him where Jesus was. He could get a pretty close idea by just looking at the star. And his soldiers could have ridden from Jerusalem to Bethlehem in less than a half hour if they rode horses. But Herod did nothing. It is really difficult to believe that Herod would not do any of these very simple, very easy things that he could have done to find out very quickly where Jesus was. But Matthew's story gets even less believable when you realize that Herod was not the only person in Jerusalem who wanted to find the Messiah. There were many other people in Jerusalem who wanted to find the Messiah. Thousands of Jews in Jerusalem desperately wanted to find the Messiah and had been waiting for him for hundreds of years. Matthew said that all Jerusalem knew about the wise men and the newborn king, and that Jews believed that the Bible prophesied that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Matthew also tells us that the star came to rest over the place where the child was. Let's assume that all of this is true. What do you think is going to happen? Everyone in Jerusalem is going to go to Bethlehem. There's going to be an enormous mob of thousands of people trying to see the new Messiah. The wise men would not be going alone. They would be accompanied by a running, panting, sweating mob of thousands of Jews, each one eager to see the newborn Messiah. Could Jesus and Mary and Joseph have slipped away unnoticed with this crowd of thousands of people clamoring to see the newborn Messiah? So let's sum up the major questions about this part of Matthew's story. Is it believable that, first, a paranoid, murderous king would do nothing when he knew where a rival king was, less than 5 miles away? Is it believable that thousands of Jews knew where the Messiah was, less than 5 miles away from where they were, but the only ones who went to see him were a small group of wise men from a foreign country? Is it believable that the Messiah could slip away unnoticed from a crowd of thousands of people who desperately wanted to see him? I'm going to leave this screen up for a few seconds so that you can save or screen print the questions if you want to. Then we'll move on to the next big question about Matthew's story. Let's move on to the next big question. Did Old Testament prophecy really predict the slaughter of the innocents? Let's start by reviewing what the Gospel of Matthew says. Then Herod sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they were no more. So, if Matthew is right, this prophecy predicts 5 distinct things. It predicts that the victims will be children, that the mothers will be descended from Rachel, that the location will be in a place called Ramah, that the crime will be murder, and the date will be centuries after the prophecy given by Jeremiah. Here's the same prophecy in the Old and New Testaments. The first thing to notice is that these quotes don't match each other. There are significant differences. This is bad news for Christians who believe that each and every individual word of the Bible is inspired by God. Apparently, the author of the Gospel of Matthew did not believe that each and every individual word of the Old Testament is inspired by God, because he changed some of the wording. Now, I'm not going to nitpick about individual words, but notice also that there is a very obvious difference in tense. Matthew uses past tense. In Jeremiah, it's present tense. As we will soon see, this is very significant. Matthew and Jeremiah are actually hundreds of years apart in their predictions. Let's look at the first prediction. Were the victims children in both Jeremiah's prophecy and in the Gospel of Matthew? The prophecy clearly says that the victims were children. So does the Gospel of Matthew. Verifying the prophecy against the checklist, we're good so far. The victims were indeed children. Let's look at the next part of the prophecy. Were the victims descended from Rachel? Who is Rachel anyway? According to the book of Genesis, Jacob, who is also named Israel, had 12 sons who became the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob had 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. Rachel bore 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Leah bore 6 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The mothers of Jacob's other 4 sons, Gad, Asher, Dan, and Naphtali, were female slaves named Zilpah and Bilhah. This is listed in the Bible in the book of Genesis 35:22 through 26. So if this prophecy is accurate, the murdered children must be members of the tribes of Joseph and or Benjamin. Otherwise, the mothers in Matthew would not be descendants or daughters of Rachel. But Bethlehem is the city of David, and David was descended from Judah. So the Bible says that Bethlehem was the city of David, and he was descended from Leah, not Rachel. So Matthew is 1 for 2 now, a 50% accuracy rate. Let's take a look at the next part of the prophecy. Did the massacre happen in Ramah? There are 3 Old Testament towns called Ramah. One was in the lands of the tribe of Benjamin. A second one was in the lands of the tribe of Ephraim. And a third one was in the lands of the tribe of Naphtali. So we see that none of these towns is anywhere near Bethlehem. 2 of them are several hours' journey from Bethlehem, and the third one is several days' journey from Bethlehem. There is just no way for Ramah to really mean Bethlehem. So Matthew is clearly wrong on this one. What about the crime that was committed? In Matthew, the crime was a hideous mass murder. Let's look at the context for Jeremiah's prophecy, that is, the verses that immediately follow Jeremiah 31:15. Although the Gospel of Matthew clearly says that the children were killed, the book of Jeremiah just as clearly says something very different. In the very next 2 verses, God himself promises twice that the children shall come back from the land of the enemy and shall come back to their own country. The book of Jeremiah very clearly is not talking about murder in this passage. It is talking about the forced deportation that happened when the Babylonian army conquered the Hebrews and took many of them back to Babylon. And God himself says in the book of Jeremiah that the children will return to their own country. Very clearly, the children are not dead in the original prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 31. So Matthew is wrong again. What about the date of the fulfillment of the prophecy? Let's look at the context again, the verses after the prophecy in the book of Jeremiah. The passage in Jeremiah very clearly says twice that the children shall return. Obviously, the children have to be alive to do this, so Jeremiah's prophecy must be fulfilled while at least some of the children are still alive. This sets a time limit on when it must be fulfilled. This time limit is obviously the maximum length of a human lifetime. That is about 100 years. But Christians believe that the birth of Jesus Christ happened over 600 years after the book of Jeremiah was written. Matthew is over 500 years late. Matthew, therefore, is wrong again. There's another good reason why we know that the book of Jeremiah cannot possibly be saying what the gospel says it is saying. The Jewish experts in Old Testament prophecy, when Jesus was born, did not recognize Jeremiah 31:15 as a prophecy that might apply to their place in time. How do we know this? The Jewish leaders knew that Herod was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him, because of the news that the wise men brought about the Messiah, the new king, being born in Bethlehem. They knew that Herod had asked them where the new Messiah, the new king, would be born. They also knew that Herod had a long history of murdering his political rivals, even including his own wife and sons. But it never occurred to the Jewish leaders to warn anyone that the children in Bethlehem might be in danger. Let's take one more look at Matthew's scorecard. Not only was he wrong 4 out of 5 times about the prophecy, this prophecy failed to proactively warn anyone that Bethlehem, or the children in Bethlehem, might be in danger. Did Jeremiah really predict the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem? Or is this a product of Matthew's imagination? Obviously, I'm trying to convince you that Matthew was wrong. But what if I am the one who is wrong? When I point out a problem with the Bible, my Christian friends very often ask me, what if I am wrong? Good question. What does it mean if I am wrong about this prophecy? What if it's a real prophecy that really worked? What does it mean if Jeremiah really did predict the mass murder of all those little boys in Bethlehem? What does that tell us about God? It tells us that God knew hundreds of years beforehand that Herod was going to murder these little boys. It tells us that God could have easily protected these little boys just as he protected the wise men, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. God is all-powerful. God can do anything he wants. But God chose not to protect those little boys from terrifying, horribly painful deaths. The Bible says that God sees everything. So God watched and did nothing as Herod's men killed and killed and killed. So, does God really love little children? Thank you for watching our video. For more interesting videos and more interesting information about the Bible and Christianity, please visit our website, freethinkersbooks.com. If you liked our video, please click the YouTube like icon, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and share our video with your friends. Thanks again.